Hey everyone, I believe that we are now live. Welcome back to another episode of the HR Leaders Podcast, the show where we explore the future of work with industry experts and HR executives on the world's leading global brands. Today we're joined by our good friend Silke Muenster, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at Philip Morris International. Welcome to the show, how are you?
I'm very well. Hi, Chris, and welcome to everybody who's watching.
Amazing. First and foremost, have you managed to go on holiday yet?
I did manage to go on holiday, though only 1 week because the other week I spent because it was my son's engagement party.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's like was a big event, and I had many guests. So I spent 1 week on vacation and 1 week for the engagement party. So
Okay.
you have to set your priorities right.
So at least you got 2 weeks off then.
Yes, I got 2 weeks off. Yeah.
I love the picture behind you, by the way, on the shelf.
Nice. I loved it as well. Yeah.
That's a cool one. Before we jump in, tell everyone a little bit more about yourself personally and your journey to where we are now.
So I'm usually I introduce myself, and some people might have heard this, is like I'm a German mathematician. And I know in inclusion and diversity, we don't like prejudice, but some of these stereotypes which come to your mind when you think about a German mathematician are actually true for myself. So
Okay.
I'm a very, very straightforward, very logical thinker, somehow numbers oriented. And that is also very important for the work I do now. I spent most of my career actually in market research, marketing, strategic planning functions, and at different multinational companies. So before joining PMI, where I'm now for 11 years, I was with Coca-Cola, and so I got into this role as Chief Diversity Officer 2.5 years ago. And that was definitely a change in career, but one I'm enjoying a lot. That was, of course, a topic always very, very close to my heart. And I really enjoy the fact that I'm now in a position where I can change things accordingly as I think they should be.
Love it. Well, I definitely didn't realize that mathematicians were going to become chief diversity officers.
Yeah, that's not what when you study mathematics, that's probably not the career path you have in mind.
Yeah, you're probably one of a kind on that. So how did... No?
I have met
Really?
other people who are in this role who also have a background, like, what you study is like, so many years ago.
Sure.
People have different career paths, but I met some other people who were close to math.
Yeah. Well, given your background then, how did this role come to be?
Honestly, it's like many other companies at PMI, there was a point in time where, we had an inclusion and diversity team before, but as part of HR. And I think there was a feeling that we made progress, but the progress wasn't fast enough. And so there was the desire to create a role as Chief Diversity Officer reporting to our CEO. And I was asked to take over because I think one of the reasons is certainly because I'm well known for not being afraid to tell truth to power. And so our CEO felt that I have enough push and the ability to push the senior team enough to make sure that progress will happen. And I think that when I was asked to take over, I didn't hesitate a second, because
Really?
that's a super important topic, and I really, and I did never regret. It's really a super interesting journey and a lot to learn, and I love learning, lifelong learning. We all know, and I think it's really one of the things, inclusion and diversity, I'm actually saying is like, and this was partially true for myself as well. So when you take over, you think like, that's kind of like, not an easy topic, but everybody has a certain understanding of inclusion and diversity. And everybody also thinks that they know what needs to be done. And only when you get into the topic, I think you see how much you actually have to learn. And to a certain extent, thankfully for me, that was also the time of Corona. So the first day I was in the job was the day of lockdown, which of course isn't ideal, but at the same time, it also gave me a lot of time of learning and listening and seeing what others are doing. And I think I still figure out that I have to learn a lot, and that other companies are doing super interesting stuff, which we haven't even thought about yet.
Mm-hmm. What would you say was your biggest misconception from looking at the function from the outside to now sitting in the seat that you had?
I think I actually underestimated some of the, especially the language. Language is something super important in this area, though sometimes I complain because I also feel that sometimes you can use language and create a distance to others. So when I think about 70,000 employees, we have factory workers as well. When we put too much emphasis on language, also we might alienate them. So it's like they might feel that they don't understand anymore what we are talking about. But in this whole area of inclusion and diversity, using the right words and using the right language is extremely important, I figured out. That is one thing I definitely wasn't aware of before. And I think you will see here is like, I'm not sure whether everybody sees, but I'm using pronouns. We had a campaign lately at PMI for encouraging everybody to use their pronouns. And that was, for example, a thing which I was not aware of at all. Is like when I joined, and the meaning it has for people, and I wasn't aware about the psychological pressure minorities feel, and what impact this has on their daily life. And I think that is, it's difficult for minorities, but you are not aware to what extent it is difficult for people from underrepresented groups.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. You mentioned earlier, obviously your background in maths, and I suppose it's no surprise then that you're very focused on measurement, which is obviously the topic of today's podcast. Can you walk our audience through the journey that you've taken with the team, and then how you're now holding both your organization, your leadership, and your stakeholders internally and externally accountable for the work that you're doing?
Yeah. I think there are two elements actually to this. So first, we called at PMI, we put a lot of focus on inclusion and inclusive culture. So our department is called inclusion and diversity, not diversity and inclusion, also to show this. And from the very beginning, I think one of the biggest questions is if inclusion is so important, is like, how do we measure inclusion? Because I think a lot of organizations show or measure their success when it comes to DEI in general by representation of underrepresented groups, and mostly women, because this is the data we all have available. And that was true for PMI as well. So we kind of measured our success by female representation, which is something which is super important, very close to my heart, as you can imagine. But there was no measure for inclusion, and it took us really a while. So we looked around, we talked to other companies, like what is the best practice, and this ended up in us then having a project together with IMD, where IMD did the research for us on inclusion, what inclusion means today, and how it gets how it can get measured.
And this is IMD Business School for everyone listening.
IMD Business School in Lausanne. Sorry,
No worries. No worries. Just so everyone knew. Sorry.
And that is one element. And the other element is that when it came to female representation, actually, we had published a goal that we wanted to get to 40% female representation by 2022, and we made progress, but rather, a steady progress, where when I took over, you couldn't really project that we would, easily end up into the 40% in 2022. And what we changed, and that gets me back to what gets measured gets done, is like what we changed it. We didn't give it as one goal, 40% for everybody, but we broke this down as targets for every people leader. So every people leader, every function, every geography, every region at PMI, they got their individual targets. So where are they today, and where do they have to be in 1 year for us to be able to get to the 40%? This took into account that in some areas, IT, for example, it's more difficult to acquire female talent, and this was part of their objectives, and it's part of how they get paid at the end of the year. So it's like their bonus payment will be depending on it, and that made a huge change, because it meant that by having this measured individually, everybody felt responsible. So it was no longer the 40% where inclusion and diversity is responsible to achieve it, but everybody saw very clearly how they can contribute and how they have to contribute for us to achieve this 40%. And there we have been super successful, because in March this year, so before end of the year, we reached this 40%. And that is now the same is what we try to do with inclusion. So we did this research with IMD, and one of the recommendations in this research is to use an inclusion net promoter score, that's how we call it, as a way, it's a one question to measure how inclusive the culture is overall and in the various teams. The question is, how likely would you recommend PMI as an inclusive employer to friends and families of underrepresented groups? And it's a scale from 0 to 10, like net promoter score, everybody who's familiar with that. And everybody who answers 9 and 10 would be called promoters. And that's how we now measure inclusion. And going forward, what will happen is that we will, like with female representation, put this into people's objectives. So everybody is like based on where they are today. So we did the measurement this year in July. Everybody will get their individual target on how we want to see inclusion to improve. And there, I think we have the results now available, and the learnings are fascinating. So as a mathematician, as a market researcher, as an IMD professional, I think super interesting learnings, because at the same time we asked people whether we asked them for a self-assessment. So I think we asked them whether they feel they are part of an underrepresented groups, and to which of the underrepresented groups they belong. So whether it's because of gender, because of sexual orientation, because of ethnicity, nationality, and in this combination, I think you can clearly see where our focus needs to be going forward. And the focus will be that people from, because everybody, I don't want to say white males, so excuse myself, but everybody who doesn't feel they are part of an underrepresented group by nature has a higher sense of feeling included. But the focus will really be to bring up the level of inclusion those people who are member of an underrepresented group feel. And that is super fascinating, because it helps us to really identify where we need to focus our work, and also where we have pockets. So it's like not only on a global level, because then you always end up with averages of averages, but in a market and in a team. So when there is a specific focus area which we need to take care of going forward.
Yeah,
I've talked a lot.
I had about 10 other questions lined up now after that.
Sorry.
So no, it was great. It was great. I was like, I was trying to make sure I could remember all the questions I had, because you were saying so many great things along the way. Where do I even start after that? It's an incredible journey. I know you're still on that, and it's never ending. Few questions in no particular order whilst I try and remember all of those. Of those, firstly, how did you approach those leaders and roll this out? Because you've now changed this. You're saying, look, now this is how it's part of how you're rewarded from your bonus. Firstly, what was the reaction from the leadership teams, and secondly, what advice would you give to the audience about how to roll something like this out and communicate it effectively?
Honestly, I don't think it's a top-down decision. So just also to mention, we didn't ask all people leaders in this organization whether they would be happy when we put an inclusion measurement into their objectives. I'm not sure how well this goes, but it wasn't difficult at all to get the agreement from our senior leadership, because I think being data driven is like every company would tell you that they are data driven, and especially also in those areas, in everything which is related to performance measurement, the more data you have available and the less subjective you make the evaluation of people, I think the better everybody feels, because I think it creates this feeling of objectivity and fairness for everybody. So for the leadership team, it was actually not difficult at all. Everybody understands that inclusion and diversity, and driving inclusion especially, is a prerequisite for PMI to be successful on our journey to create a smoke-free world. So the business case for inclusion and diversity is very clear for our senior leaders, and therefore including this measurement was actually, I think, was very welcome. There was I didn't have any resistance when we proposed this.
It's the same. I'm assuming it's the same for the rest of the leadership team, right? The CEO, CFO.
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
all tied to their own bonuses too, obviously.
Yes, their own bonuses will be based on this one as well. And it's like, to be also clear, because some people might be well aware of legal issues, especially in the US, less so in Europe. You might have that, you don't want to give the impression that male are discriminated by having a female representation target. So it's not mathematical. It's like you're not saying, this is exactly 10%, but it's a very important fact to evaluate the how, because it's like you have the
Sure.
What objectives, like did you achieve your volume targets, your market share targets, and then you have how objectives. How are you showing up as a people leader? And that's a very important fact, which will inform how well you are doing as a people leader, and therefore an important part of your compensation at the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you communicate this? That part is so important in any of these initiatives. Companies get this really wrong sometimes. So yeah, what do you think worked best? Looking back, what worked best for you in terms of communication?
To the SM, to our senior management,
to roll this whole initiative out to all of the leaders.
I think what works, I think, to be honest, is like people appreciated the fact that they have individual targets which take into account, and that's what we always, the discussion we always had with them. We made sure that these targets, whatever targets we give them, are realistic. So we take into account that certain departments, one of the things we see, for example, is like, those who really have a lot of diversity in terms of ethnicity, women, sexual orientation, they struggle more with INPS. So you need to be fair. They need to be rewarded for the fact that they have a high diversity. So they get realistic inclusion targets going forward. And the same is true vice versa. So those who have a lower diversity have a relatively nice inclusion index, but there we need to focus more on them increasing diversity in their teams. So as long as you show people leaders that this is not something where we kind of randomly break down and everybody has to achieve X, that you really make sure you take care of their individual situation, and that this is ultimately helping them to improve. And I think as long as you do it like this, which requires, so we have models behind and what have you, So a lot of work also our people analytics team is doing to support us there. As long as you do it like this, I think then the buy-in is great, and also people leaders actually also appreciate this, that when they evaluate their own employees, their team members, that they have facts at their hand which help them to evaluate how good they are doing the job. Because this measurement of how is like how are you showing up is sometimes difficult for everybody. So having facts behind which help and guide you is actually appreciated. So I think you have to be mindful that people understand this is not something where we ask them to do something which is completely unrealistic.
Yeah, that's the last thing you want, right? It shouldn't feel like a blanket statement for everyone.
Exactly.
As well. And it's great that they feel empowered, they have that data in their hands to help inform their decisions now, as well. How often are you doing the surveys?
We have pulse surveys like 3 times a year.
3 times.
And the INPS and ENPS, they have different questions at different times in the year, so we have a rhythm there. But the INPS and ENPS will be part of so we will measure 3 times a year. That is going forward. We will continue this. For example, in springtime, we always have, we also measure psychological safety specifically, because that was also one of the results we had from the Inclusive Future research, how important psychological safety is in order to create an inclusive environment. And therefore, we have specific questions on psychological safety and measure this always in springtime as well.
I know someone in the chat's probably going to ask me, so I'll ask you now. What are the platforms you're using? How are you? Which platforms are you using, and how are then the leaders accessing this information?
Yeah, we are using Qualtrics. It's like by the way, it's like what I used in market research as well. So very easy for me. And everybody is like, so PNC has access to global data, but team members, people leaders have access to their own team data. And there's even an automatic function which produces a report for them. So they simply click a button and then they have a report. And I think that has really the ability, or the people are really keen to seeing their own data and working with this data. And I think, but even more importantly, what we see, we have really high, a high percentage of people answering the questionnaire. So it's like we have really a good response rate. And this is because people really see that we are taking this data and we are using it to create a better environment at PMI for everybody, and this credibility over time has really helped us in getting those questions answered.
So what are some of those insights then you've taken away that you and the team are now actioning at the moment?
Yes, I think for us one important element is that we clearly see there's kind of a ranking, like where do we need to focus. So, and I know a lot of people don't want to hear it anymore, and it's as PMI, and I'm pretty sure everywhere else, there's a kind of fatigue when you talk about gender. But unfortunately, we see that this is still the biggest issue. So we clearly see that women and also there we see that actually, especially the more senior women, because we also still have a pyramid, like, more female representation in junior roles, less female representation in senior roles, though we have improved big time. But we see that clearly those women who are in senior roles where there are less women around, that they struggle more with inclusion. And that's where we have the lowest inclusion index. And so I think whether people like to hear it or not, it will continue to be a priority, because we clearly see that this is needed. We also, I think, one of the areas we have for example, we have an employee resource group which is embrace on race and ethnicity. And of course, race and ethnicity, when you talk around the globe, means very different things, whether you are in Asia or in Africa or in Europe, for example. So we were always struggling to where should we put the focus. And there we see, for example, very clearly that in some African countries, we really have a bigger problem with people from different ethnicities don't feeling included and don't feeling that they have the right role models. And that is something where now, together with our ERG, we can put regional focus on Africa to work on these problems of inclusion. Then we see that in some European markets and also in Switzerland, we have bigger issues for people with disability. And honestly, we see the data that we have a problem. We now also still need to do the work and see what exactly the problems are people are having. And while people with disability, they specifically feel less included than in other markets.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is some Asian markets where we know people with sexual orientation have a bigger problem. So I think it very nicely gives us an opportunity to target really our interventions going forward, and having a combination of which group and in which area, and the same is true for some functions. Women are struggling more than in others, so you can be much more targeted in what you do going forward, and that is extremely helpful. So I think we are super excited with this going forward.
How do you communicate? So, for example, you mentioned that first area of the female leadership. How do you communicate back to the organization that you're actually working on there?
Yeah, that is a good question. We are in the process because we received the data like 6 weeks ago.
Oh, okay.
So we are in the process of how do we communicate this? We communicate the data definitely the way it is. So it's like, I'm a big believer into transparency. It's like, we ask people to give us those answers, and we will share the results, no matter how good or how bad they are, and we will communicate. I think the data will help us to get a better understanding why women and gender is still very high on our agenda, because it's like, the data clearly shows you where the issue is. And we have, I think, already started. We had the discussion with our management team, and we have another session together with the whole management team to discuss what to do, especially for senior women. So I think that is something we will communicate, but having the data is actually helpful, because it's like, it's not because we feel that women is an issue.
So you share that. You
but
say
we have a proof point.
Yeah, because the reason I was asking that is most companies, they do these surveys and you do it, and the employees never hear back. They have no idea. And then they wonder why people don't fill in the next one.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm not seeing any results. So the fact that you're already putting that data out there and being very transparent to say, look, clearly we've got an issue here, and sharing that is a big step. You're not saying straight away we have the solution, but at least you're saying we're working on it. We can see.
And that is where people, I think in the beginning, meanwhile, there's a better understanding. Where people sometimes struggle is, even if I see a result, so for example, health and well-being, one of the big topics everybody has currently as well, is like, so we did a big survey, even seeing the results, it takes a while to analyze the data, to then discuss what is the best way going forward. You usually pilot things, so you don't go with a global intervention. So you pilot certain things, and you need to get the agreement. In every big company, you have many stakeholders. So you need to get everybody on board to implement something globally. And that is what people struggle sometimes to understand, that from a moment of the survey and understanding where the issues are to implementing solutions, that might take a while, but not because we are lazy or whatever, or don't want to implement. Just, every global company, you have processes behind.
Related to that line of thought, we have a comment from Suhani who says, If the top level adapts and believes in the DE&I initiatives, it's a great thought to have it added to the leadership KPI to ensure the index improves, but how to deal with challenges or roadblocks, if any, at the senior management level?
I think you mentioned earlier, so we didn't have many challenges.
So it's like we have a senior management.
You were lucky, but maybe for our audience members, what advice would you give in terms of how to present it to get to be in the best position to get the buy-in?
I think you need to start at the very top. You need to start with your CEO, and once you have the buy-in from your CEO, that will make it so much easier to go down. And I think in our case also is like the board is very much behind it. So we discussed this already last year with our board. So I think that makes it really difficult for people to openly show that they are against. I would not say that if I take all our top 200 leaders, I'm pretty sure there are some who think that this is not the best idea ever we had to measure this and put this into their objectives. But I think it's super, super difficult for them to really go against it. And I think therefore you need to create allies always. It's like in every company you will have allies and the ones who are the friendly ones. And when you start with them and then create an atmosphere which makes it more difficult for others to resist, I think that is always the way to go about it.
And I think also you said it earlier. You led with data, right? You were like, you didn't go into that meeting saying, "Here's my opinion."
Yeah.
It was like, here's the data, here's the insights. This is what we're hearing, and so it's very transparent, super clear. And these are the specific areas that we're focusing on that we feel like we can have an impact that are, I'm sure, in line with the overall business objectives. Super clear, right?
Yeah.
Here's the problem. Here's the problem we're solving, as well. So I hope that helps.
We've got another question from Julie, who comments, regarding gender especially, having the data is so important, like you just said, but what will truly make a difference is a change in the larger culture, not just within your organization. That's a heavy lift. Any thoughts on how to communicate this and not give in to being defeatist?
Larger culture means using our influence as a company. Is like many other companies, we are working on supplier diversity programs. So trying to use our influence with the suppliers of PMI. So what we are currently doing is we put into our guidelines that other suppliers, they need to have an DI program as well. That doesn't mean we ask them to have the same 40%, because based on where they start, that's a problem. But for sure, we want them to be aware of their numbers, of how diverse is their workforce, and have a program in place to improve diversity in their workforces. That is one. We look at the business we do with minority-owned businesses, like women-owned businesses, for example. That's a very difficult topic to empower women entrepreneurs, etc. So these are areas where you can use as a company your influence in your and your footprint for other companies. That is one way. I absolutely agree. There are certain areas when it comes to women and gender equality where it's really difficult, because it requires societal change. So whatever we do as a company, so the fact that it's still mostly women taking care and taking maternity leave, and though we have gender equal parental leave guidelines, that doesn't mean that all men are taking parental leave. I think the things will happen in society, but that is always a dialogue with stakeholders externally, and that's not going to happen overnight.
Definitely. I remember last time we spoke as well, you mentioned, I wrote this down, that we need to get the heart and the brain.
Yeah, very important always. It's like two for everybody. It's like two when you talk to employees, and it's two when you talk to your SMT. So it's like you need to get their heart and their brain. So numbers is one.
Yeah.
But it's always important also to bring something, we always bring case studies or videos of employees talking about difficulties they are seeing, so that people can envision. So it always needs to be the combination, and storytelling again works with everybody, with your employees, when you talk to employees, and when you talk to your senior management team. They are normal people, honestly. So.
I think you're right. That is the combination, right? It's the storytelling to going to your leadership team, sharing, here's a video, right? Or of one of our employees talking about these. Yeah. And also here is the data. Then you've got, as you said, if you get the heart and the brain, then you're going to be very successful.
Yes, that is super important.
Silke, before I let you go, firstly, absolutely love this. And been great having you on the show. And I feel like
thanks for having me.
Who would have thought a mathematician would be Chito herself? But I love it because it's so interesting how you can already feel the influence of that journey and how that's impacted the role, the way you look at this with the analytical mindset. Because many companies really struggle in terms of this topic of how do you measure. Everyone has their own version, right? And it's going to be different for each organization. We're not saying there's a one size fits all. It's what works for your business. Before I let you go, what would be one parting piece of advice would you give to our listeners around this topic? And where can they connect with you if they want to reach out to you personally?
I think one piece of advice, as you said, is like the one thing which is true in DI as well as everywhere else is there's no one size fits all. So it's like, you really have to start, and you mentioned it before, you have to link your DE&I strategy to your business objectives. So there's no point in taking somebody else's solution and just plug it onto your company. You need to make sure that this works in the environment you are in to get the credibility, and you get to get people in your company to listen. I think that is super important. My plea is this inclusion net promoter score. The whole research we have done with IMD is available on pmi.com on our website, so you can read this. And inclusion net promoter score is actually one question, super easy to implement, is not a big deal. And I would love if we would find more companies doing this and being able to compare, because also measuring is one, but looking at where others are to see what can good look like. So I think that would be wonderful. That is really, we can only encourage others to try to use this. And what was your last question? I forgot now.
I said, where can people connect with you if they want to reach out? Because I'm sure they
on LinkedIn, definitely. LinkedIn.
Amazing. Well, look, thanks so much for coming on, and it's been a real pleasure. And for everyone listening, we'll try and get all of the links in the chat. And whether you're watching on LinkedIn or YouTube or listening on the podcast player as well, we'll link all of the details in the description. So check that out there. Also, make sure you go and connect with Silke on LinkedIn. Apart from that, enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you again soon. Bye, everyone. Bye, Silke.
Ciao. Bye. Chris. Have a nice day.
Bye.